Hi, you are in the ladies' room with Dr. Donica, the only public ladies' room you can enter anytime without ever waiting online. I'm your host, Dr. Donica Moore. We'll be having real conversations with real women about really intimate issues. They may be embarrassing, sad, or funny, but they will always be interesting and informative. You know, like the best conversations you've had in ladies' rooms with your best friends, or total strangers and a physician. Please join us. Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of In the Ladies Room with Dr. Donica. We have a great guest for you today, Nancy Shenker. She is a publisher and author and a self-described Chief Disruptive Idea Officer at sheboom.com. I have to ask her if that's what's on her business card. I love that title.
No, my business card is actually pretty tame.
You should have it.
I tailor my message depending on who I'm talking to because I may be too disruptive and too high energy for some people. So.
Well, not for the ladies' room. We have lots of high energy here, but let me finish telling people that you're also the CEO and founder of theONswitch Marketing, a professional writer and speaker, a Huffington Post contributor, and the author of one of my new favorite books, or definitely my favorite title, Don't Hook Up with the Dude in the Next Cube. And we are definitely going to talk about that. She's also the publisher of Embrace the Machine and one of the co-founders of sheboom.com. Now, she says her passions are huge business concepts, writing, scaling businesses, mentoring and coaching, useful technology, and admittedly watching reality TV. We're going to talk about whatever comes to mind, as we often do in the ladies' room, but mostly about her book, which is mostly about how young women need to navigate the workplace. But it also includes a section on in-office romance, which we're going to talk about. Now, many of us have gone there throughout our careers. We all have stories that we may or may not want to share. And in many cases, they have happy endings. And of course, we're talking about the romantic kind, not the creepy massage parlor kind. But of course, the Me Too movement exists for a reason, and new prominent examples are raising their ugly heads daily, thanks to reporters such as my new hero, Ronan Farrow. Now, while the Me Too movement has given many women comfort in knowing that they're not alone in their experiences and that sexual harassment, abuse, and of course, assault are wrong and should be reported, what it has also done to a much larger extent is raise issues of what's appropriate office behavior versus what isn't. So, of course, my message to anyone who's uncertain is that all they need to ask. Of course, the Me Too movement is about consent, but also about power. And with that intro, let me welcome a very powerful woman into the ladies' room, Nancy Shenker. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, tell us, what is the most unique, interesting, or memorable experience you've ever had in a ladies' room aside from this interview?
Well, I'm fairly fearless, but one of my biggest irrational fears is actually getting stuck in a stall.
Okay.
And I think it dates back to high school when I was at a private school where there were a lot of mean girls and I was the new kid, and I locked myself in a stall. And I remember sitting there and thinking, if I were yelling, would anybody come to rescue me? Or would I not to sound like a total victim, but yeah, that's probably my most memorable.
How'd you get out?
And followed by, actually, and this is only within the last year, I was in the ladies' room at a tech company that I was consulting to, and two of the women from HR were sitting in the stalls next to me having what I thought was a fairly private conversation with each other.
About
something relating to company policy or something that was going on at the company. So, I think my cautionary note there is when you're in the ladies' room at work, you sort of have to, I should have put that in my next edition of my book. You always have to look at the shoes and figure out who might be in the stall next to you before you start having an intimate conversation.
Yeah, that's actually a very good reminder. Although I have to say that I'm delighted to hear that there are women in tech companies in powerful enough positions in HR that they're talking about company policy in the ladies' room. We usually think about that as the old boys club talking about those kind of things on the golf course. But I will tell you that one of the things we always tell medical students and residents who are in training is we do have to remind all of them not to talk about patients in the elevator.
Right.
Because that's another place where people often have conversations not knowing who else is in the ladies' room with us. But anyway, you left us all hanging about the Mean Girls episode where you got locked in the stall in high school.
Oh,
How
I
did you
did
get
a
out?
MacGyver moment, and I, used whatever I had with me, and managed to. I couldn't actually fit under the door. That was one of my options.
I've
But I
done
was
that.
able to finally get the lock open, and I still actually have a scar on one of my knuckles from. But the more. I'm a lemonade maker, so the moral of that story is there's always a way out of a sticky situation, but you do sometimes need to know when to ask for help.
And I guess no pun intended about the sticky situation. I've had situations where I've had to crawl under the door in the ladies' room, and the floor is often rather disgusting.
Yeah, I just actually saw that episode of Seinfeld where Elaine runs out of toilet paper, and Jerry's girlfriend refuses to give her toilet paper because there's not a lot in her stall. So speaking of Mean Girls and lack of cooperation, that was like a great episode. That's one of the best ladies' room comedy moments I've ever seen.
Well, I have to say, in general, the girls who were the mean girls in high school generally grow up to be pretty mean, unhappy women. Although, spoiler alert, Mean Girls on Broadway does not end the same way Mean Girls the movie ends.
Oh,
So
I'll have to check it
anybody who
out.
hasn't seen it and who can go to a Broadway show, I loved Mean Girls on Broadway. Anyway, so tell us about you.
So I am on probably my, fifth reinvention. Worked in publishing right out of college, thought I was going to be a lawyer, decided not to go that route, got a graduate degree in publishing, ended up working in financial services. So you talk about being a woman in a man's world. As I often said, I was clearly the pork chop at the bar mitzvah. I was in a lot of senior meetings where I was the only woman at the table. And I grew up with two brothers and a strong mother and father. So I was able to really navigate my way through that environment. So Citibank, MasterCard, finally got to the C-suite at a company called Reed Exhibitions, which is the producers of Comic-Con, and had along the way had two daughters, and then realized that I'd spent a lot of my life doing things that I didn't really enjoy. I had never intended to go into financial services, although it was a great work and life experience. So I ended up starting my own marketing consulting practice about 15 years ago, and then really closing the loop, starting my own publishing imprint. And in addition to my marketing consulting work, I've now written 4 books.
Wow.
I'm working on my 5th, all self-published under my own imprint, New Media.
Great.
And as you mentioned, my last 2, and the 2 I'm probably the most proud of, I joke around, my first 2 were like business comic books, and these are books with spines, so they have more substance to them. They are Embrace the Machine, which is about how, with Jim Darkangelo, which is about how technology and machine learning and robotics and AI are ultimately going to affect all of our jobs heading into the future. In fact, in 5 years, maybe our avatars would be doing this interview. And then, as you mentioned, my book, Don't Hook Up with the Dude in the Next Cube, which I was inspired to write after an incident with an intern, not a hookup incident, but just a bad behavior incident. And I was talking to a 20-something.
One of your interns or another?
One of my interns, yeah. And so I had another 20-something-year-old young woman who I was mentoring, and I said, why do young women sometimes self-destruct in their first couple of jobs out of college? And she said, well, nobody's really told them the differences between college and the workplace. So Lindsay Brown and I co-authored Don't Hook Up with the Dude in the Next Cube, which does have a chapter on office canoodling, but got a lot of other things in it too related to being a woman in the workforce.
So before we hear more about office canoodling, because you know that's what I want to talk about, tell us more details about what happened with this particular intern.
She was upset with me, as all young women sometimes get with their woman bosses or with any boss.
Okay.
and she was web chatting with somebody else, calling me horrific names, including the C word.
Oh my goodness.
And then bringing my daughters into it, who she'd never met.
And she
But
was web chatting in the workplace about this?
Yeah, and then forgot to shut down her screen when she left at the end of the day.
Oh my goodness.
So back to what we were talking about in terms of never really knowing who's listening or watching.
I hope you fired her.
I did. And what was interesting is when I let her go, she said something like, I'm sorry I hurt your feelings. And I said, well, no, it doesn't have anything to do with my feelings. I've never called any of my supervisors by that word, but I have said nasty things about bosses. I said the difference was that you didn't have the common sense to realize that you were typing this on my computer in my workplace. And so it wasn't an insult issue, it was a common sense issue. And I actually ran into her years later, and she told me that I had taught her a valuable life lesson. It was her first internship right out of college. So yeah, I think it probably will stick with her for the rest of her life. And she was inspiration for my writing my book, so I can't.
Right. And that gets to making lemonade. You know, we can often be inspired by negative situations. And it's shocking to me sometimes how much young people don't know. And I feel this way sometimes as a parent. I have this great anxiety, and I'm a parent of two young adult children, but I have this great anxiety that there's something I forgot to teach them, you know, and I still try to impart as much of my wisdom and nagging and annoying tips as possible, because I would never want them to be in a situation like that. Not that either of my children they have great common sense, but I would hate to be them in a negative situation of any kind where they said, you never told me that, or you forgot to tell me that.
Well, that's why I wrote the book. I mean, it's quick tips. It's 200 tips. You can read them. There's an e-version. There's a print version. Both my daughters, who are now adults, read it before they started their first jobs. There's even a section in there about how to figure out what you might want to do when you grow up, or what to do when you are having issues related to self-esteem in the workplace, or if you aren't getting along with your coworkers. So basically, I took every lesson that I had learned throughout my career and packaged it in a way that would be appealing to the next generation of women in the workforce.
That's awesome. Do you have a section about not texting while you're on the job?
Yeah, I mean, I do talk about private communications while you're at work. In my company, we used to have a phones down and laptop closed policy when we were having meetings, and this was my symbol for eye contact. And I do think that it's important as managers that because we're dealing with a population that's grown up with devices and with 24/7 access, if we have ground rules about the use of technology, the same way parents limit screen time, you sort of have to lay those rules out at the very beginning.
The problem is a lot of people take notes on their phone or their laptop. So you don't know if they're legitimately taking notes or if they're on Facebook during the meeting.
Well, that's why, you know, when I have people working in my office, I give them all a spiral notebook and we sort of go old school, and I say afterwards, if you want to transcribe your notes onto your laptop, that's actually a great way to remember what you heard. But everybody's got a physical notebook, and they actually like it because, you know, it keeps them, they don't forget how to write. You know, I read that they're not teaching cursive anymore in schools. So
yeah, my handwriting has really deteriorated just from not practicing.
Mine as well.
But I remember the first day I ever learned about Twitter. I was doing a television interview with a live studio audience on the Anderson Cooper show. And I was shocked that like half the audience was on their phones during the show. And I said to the producer, like, what is going on? I've never seen this before. And she said, we invite a large number of bloggers and they're live tweeting during the show. And I'm like, tweeting? What is that? So that is how I learned about Twitter and got into, and I was actually a slow entrant into the Twitterverse. But I have now got there, and I admit I now spend way too much time on Twitter. But people, of course,
I was a super early adapter. I started using it at a conference, and people, it was actually the week that Twitter had launched. So we all had this new toy. And it was really useful in a closed loop situation because people in one conference session were tweeting people in other conference sessions saying this session's really good. And people do that a lot now too, that if you can't attend simultaneous conference sessions, or you're at an event and there are lots of things going on, it's a great way. It's like an old school walkie-talkie. It's a way of telling other people what's happening in the moment right then and there. And then even I happen to like, as I said earlier, I confess to watching some trash TV, but I will, like when I'm watching the Oscars, I'll do the 2-screen experience. I'll get into a group of people who are also watching and I'll be following along their commentary.
Yeah, that's great. The first time I really appreciated Twitter was when I was a speaker at a conference. And I realized that if I followed the hashtag for the conference, I could actually see what people were saying about my presentation. And fortunately, in that situation, it was mostly positive. So that was very gratifying and I enjoyed it. But some of our best podcast guests have come from women I've met and interacted with on Twitter.
Yeah, and you'll appreciate this. One of my favorite new quotes is, "Tech, like sex, is wasted on the young." So they know what buttons to push and they have access to all the media, but they don't necessarily know how to use technology for business purposes or
they don't have the finesse. So speaking of finesse, let's talk about office canoodling, because I promised everybody that's what we would be talking about. So tell me about the chapter and tell me about your thoughts and feelings and certainly your experiences about the topic.
Well, I have I guess my perspective is that when you're in your 20s, your judgment is just not fully formed. You have limited life experience, you've had limited business experience. I read that the human brain doesn't even fully develop until age 26. You're the doctor, so you would know if that's true or not.
Well, actually, in males at 26, females a little bit earlier.
All right. But, when we're young, we sometimes make decisions based on our hearts rather than our heads, our bodies rather than our brains. With men, they say the little head is thinking rather than the big head. And, women grew up with this, Barbie queen of the prom fantasy. So sometimes decisions that young people make in the workplace, they haven't seen or experienced enough to know the ramifications.
I just have to interrupt for a second and make a comment directed to all of our millennial listeners that we are certainly well aware that some of the biggest offenders in the Me Too movement in the media are not in their 20s.
Oh,
they're
not
men in their 50s and 60s and 70s who are certainly old enough to know better. So,
and that was actually going to be my next point, is when office hookups become a problem is when the balance of power is involved. And when young women or young men feel like they need to go along with somebody's advances because if they don't, it might hurt their career or they might get in trouble as a result. So those are situations where it can be really, really tough. And what will go through your head is, all right, if I shut this person down, is my career over? Which is what a lot of the Me Too movement was all about, where women truly felt that if they didn't say yes, there'd be revenge involved.
So we're talking about different categories of situations, right? I mean,
exactly,
the first category is situations where there's no consent. And that we all agree is egregious and needs to be reported and needs to be stamped out. The category you're now talking about is where there's sort of consent, but it's really coerced consent.
Or perceived coerced consent.
Right.
And I think women, again, and men, because it works both ways.
Absolutely.
Have to be comfortable saying, this is making me uncomfortable.
Or this is inappropriate.
Yeah.
In some companies, they use this red light, green light thing where they don't have to say any words other than red light.
Right.
Yeah. Like, this is just wrong. And that's what you could say when somebody's passing around, dick pics, right before the meeting. Or in the case of this recent Fox News host who was a woman whose name I've forgotten. If you remember, you can say it. I'm not being delicate, but she was fired in part because she was passing around really inappropriate photos. And
I worked in a big corporation once, and the head of HR's admin assistant accidentally sent a Chippendales calendar to everybody in the sales database. So most of the company, and as a woman, I was offended. I was like, this is just not off, especially because it came from someone in HR, which I thought was this was a long time ago before the Me Too movement. I mean, obviously, if it happened today, she would have been fired on the spot, and there would have been, lots and lots of training and discussion, and it does work both ways. I have a story of a male manager who was mentoring a young woman, and she took that as the fact that he was interested in her sexually, and sort of jumped him and that put him in an awkward position.
Wow.
So it can happen every which way. And then you have the category that we can't really forget about. I was watching the TV show Younger last night, which is just a great show about an older woman who fakes her age so she can stay employed. Mm-hmm. But she falls in love with her boss in the workplace, and I don't want to be the spoiler, but there's so many examples of prominent figures, Bill and Melinda Gates and the Obamas. And there are many, many examples of people who just started out working together. And then because they had common interests, because they got to know each other, we do spend so much time at work that it's inevitable that people are going to fall in love with people who they, or be attracted to people who they work with. And there you just have to know what the rules are. The CEO of Intel, he had no excuse. He was the CEO, and his own employee handbook said you can't have a relationship with somebody you're working with or who's working for you. And because he was the CEO, everybody in the company was working for him. So if he did want to go there, he should have at least sat down with HR beforehand and revised the employee handbook.
Right, absolutely. And sometimes employee handbooks make rules like that that are just too extreme and not really practical. So, in other companies, they have situations that if you have a relationship with a coworker, it needs to be disclosed to your boss. Or you can't have a romantic involvement with somebody who's directly reporting to you, which seems like a really good rule. And I think, that's is a great point for a lot of companies, is to think about what's actually in their employee handbook, but also to think about, okay, what are going to be the consequences for this, and what are going to be the unintended consequences? Exactly. Because we do have to accept that people are going to hook up, and they may not fall in love. They may just hook up, and then you have the problem of an unhappy breakup situation or an awkward work situation as a result of that. So
exactly.
One of the questions I get from men a lot frequently, and I'd love you to comment on this, is how do you know if it's okay to flirt with somebody in the office? Or how, men are now saying that they can't hire an attractive woman because they'll be accused of, just being interested in her physically, or they have to worry about her accusing him of making inappropriate sexual advances.
Or men being afraid to have lunch alone with a woman because they're afraid. Mike Pence had said that he has that policy now, or he'll invite his wife along to business lunches. And it's unfortunate that it's come to that. and maybe it's just because I grew up in Queens and I have a mouth on me. I was never really afraid of repercussions. So if there was ever a man who was even in a, higher position than I was, who said, I'm interested in you, I would just shut it down. If
I
a man
think
just
it
wants,
depends on how good looking he was.
um, the whole thing of men being afraid to have anything to do outside of work with women, that is just really, really unfortunate.
It's
And
unfortunate and it's also ridiculous because
yeah,
if you have a business lunch with somebody, it's at an appropriate public restaurant. You should not have a business lunch with somebody in your hotel room. That is not
exactly.
appropriate. If you're in your hotel and you want it to be a business lunch, you have it at the restaurant in the hotel. And if it's a hotel that doesn't have a restaurant, it's not an appropriate hotel for a business lunch.
Exactly. So my guidelines would just be to, you know, avoid alcohol or avoid nighttime meetings because that can be really ambiguous. As you said, avoid hotels because even saying let's meet at the hotel can be taken the wrong way unless you're at a conference. But even if you're at a conference, there are other places that meetings can take place. And I'm not saying anything, to men that wouldn't apply to women as well. My co-author of Embrace the Machine, Jim Darkangelo, and I have been teaching workshops about women in technology. And it's great having him with me talking about it because then the men are more likely to show up for the panel, which is ironic in many ways. But I think what is going to ultimately fix the problem is for men and women to sit together and talk about some of these issues. And I hope that a lot of men will click on and listen to this podcast because, there are places where it's important for women to feel like they're in a safe environment when they talk about certain things. But there are other times, in fact, I was at a tech conference recently and they had these women in tech roundtables. And I was like, can't we have some guys around here because they need to hear this as much as we do? Like we know these things already.
Although it depends on the objective. If the objective is to support each other, then I think that's often best in a female-only environment or discussion group. I was very involved in the American Medical Women's Association for decades. And invariably, I would often hear from a man who said, well, why don't we have the Men's Medical Association? And I used to reply, we do. It's called the American Medical Association. And yes, you're welcome to come if you want to participate in this. And there'd always be one or two guys who did. But seriously, can't we have our own thing once in a while? This podcast is not only open and welcome to men and women, but we do hear from a lot of men who have, we always welcome questions for people to submit their questions to me on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. And I even set up a private email address for people who want to be anonymous to askdrdonica@gmail.com. And I invariably get questions from men, and they're very sincere, but it tells me that they're listening. I don't collect demographic data on our listeners other than their country of origin where they're listening from. And so very exciting. We have listeners now in 32 countries. So that's exciting. I don't know what percentage are men, but I do hear a lot of questions from them.
That's great, because I do think there's a perception among many men that when women get together, it's all about, anger and whining and complaining, which sometimes admittedly it is.
But usually we're making fun of them.
And, that's no better than men getting together and talking disrespectfully about women. So
you mean locker room talk?
Yes, and I don't think that that's appropriate either. I think when any group gets together and for the purpose of just ragging on the group that's not there, it's just a variation on the mean girls and boys. And I know I sound really Pollyanna-ish, but I do think that the workplace and the world will get a lot better when people are more comfortable sitting in rooms together and discussing the issues. My younger daughter, Lowell, insisted, she didn't insist, she actually cajoled me for a while. In fact, in the book, they say you should never insist that somebody read it.
Mm-hmm.
But over the course of a few months, she kept asking me to read a book called Crucial Conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And it really was a life changer because it creates a framework for having difficult conversations in a way that people don't run out of the room screaming or get into, major unproductive arguments. And we just all need to get a lot better at discussing the real issues. And I think the media has just continually put gasoline on the Me Too fire, to the point where I think a lot of really good guys are being witch hunted because they did something once that was then pulled out and thrown in their face.
Yeah. But I actually had this conversation with a guy who's the CEO of a small size company last night. And what I pointed out is the guys who are being, witch hunted, as you said, in the media, the guys who are being covered extensively, the Bill Cosbys and the Les Moonves and the what's his name, the producer in Hollywood,
Harvey Weinstein.
Yeah. Those guys have tens, 20s, hundreds of women who have come out with stories about them.
Absolutely.
That is not a witch hunt. And Bill Cosby, what started this is because there were 63 women who said he sexually assaulted them, not like put his hand on their shoulder, while they were typing. So how many women have to testify against a man or tell their story till it is believed? And I think where we also grapple with this, if somebody's really good at their job, so let's take Al Franken, for example, and yes, there were 7 or 8 women who came forward with stories about Al Franken, quote unquote, groping them. But the details of that groping were his hand shifted down while they were taking a photograph. I do not put that in the same category as the Harvey Weinstein situation. And the irony, and certainly there's still, let's not forget, there's still 13 women who have very credible sexual assault claims against our sitting president.
Absolutely.
So I think sexual assault, and especially one of them is a minor or was a minor at the time. And there's no statute of limitations, by the way, on sexual assault against a minor. And people need to know that. So we have to be very clear when we're talking about that annoying guy in the office who always feels like it's okay to come up behind you and massage your shoulders, even though you've said, stop. That's very different than a Harvey Weinstein who invites an aspiring actress up to his hotel room and rapes her, or, relieves himself into a plant. Yeah, that's a totally, totally different, or a Bill Cosby who drugged women and then raped them.
Yeah.
Allegedly.
And a lot of these incidents, though, did happen in the media world and in the political world, where you have a lot of very, very powerful men who wield their power.
But this happens everywhere. We heard from one actress who talked about how when she was working in Payless in a shoe store, she was raped in the stockroom by, somebody else working in the stockroom. The thing is that these are powerful women, or women who have become empowered to speak out about their story. I can certainly tell you stories about what goes on in medicine till the cows come home. And I used to run a workshop for the American Medical Women's Association called How to Handle Put Downs and Insults in the Workplace. We didn't even get to sexual harassment and sexual assault. It was just, things like how to use humor to handle. I had a situation where a surgeon was groping my leg while we were operating together, which first of all breaks all kinds of hygiene rules and anti-infection control rules in the hospital. And he was an attending and I was a resident, so there was a huge power gap there. And there were several other people in the room while this was happening, but they couldn't see what was going on under the table. So I lifted his arm And I said, does this belong to anybody? I found it on my leg, which was very humorous at the time. It was horrible because then we both had to leave and go re-scrub because we were both no longer sterile. That was a very awkward 3 minutes. But of course, I never got to operate with him again. And of course, while I never wanted to operate with him again, that was not good for my training. It was very good for my ego, but not good for my training. So those are the trade-offs that women are often put in the position of making is, do I speak up? Do I say something? Do I interrupt? And that wasn't a horrible situation. I don't have any lingering, guilt or shame or any feelings about that. But it was annoying, and it was not the first time. And I was certainly not the only woman who he did things like that or worse to.
Yeah. And I guess the rule of thumb is, or the rule of leg is always to, first try to talk to the offender. Unless it's something extreme like what you just talked about. If someone's making you uncomfortable in the workplace, or they're making jokes that you find to be inappropriate, or they're hitting on you one time too often, is to just say, and I think because we're living in a world right now where there is much more awareness, to just have that calm discussion and say, what you said. And this happened to me recently. I was at a small business presentation, and one of my co-presenters was making jokes about how he liked Skyping with these women, and imagining that even though they had shirts on, that they were in their underwear or something like that. And it was right after the Me Too movement. I was one of the only women on the panel, and afterwards I just said to him, I know these women and you think it's really funny, but I didn't really find it humorous. Mm-hmm. And the same way I wouldn't find it humorous is if a woman, I'm not a prude, but like if a woman was in a business setting and was talking about men wearing their boxer shorts while she was Skyping with them, I would say that has no place in the workplace either.
I even had a situation the other day in my own home where I had a contractor come to talk about an estimate for some work that I needed to do on the house. And we're chit-chatting, and he's telling me about, famous people who live in our area who he's done work for, which was totally appropriate until he mentioned Mike Tyson. And I just shut him down and I said, we don't talk about Mike Tyson in this house. And this is in my home. And he said, oh yeah, I know he raped a couple of women, but he's really a great guy. And, I really like him. And I was like, did you not hear the part where and he passed it off like, oh, he raped a couple of women and, that's okay. And I said, and beat a couple of his wives. And he didn't get it that was inappropriate. He also didn't get it that I wasn't going to hire him because of that. Right. And I think that's the other thing, that now that women are in positions, whether we're hiring people to work in our own homes or in our companies that we're running or in departments that we're running, they fail to understand that that's going to affect their hiring and promotion decisions as well. But I think, it gets to the issue of how do you know what's appropriate? And this gets back to what I always say about just ask.
Exactly. And, if someone says, I'm sorry, that's making me uncomfortable, or I wish you wouldn't talk about that, that's a gentle first time warning. The second time it happens, you escalate it. And if it happens a third time, that is really when you need to take action. And whether that's in a corporate setting, it means going to human resources or filing a formal complaint. There's a lot of bad behavior out there right now. I'm not denying it, but I also think there are a lot of really good guys and good women who are just confused about what to do in the workplace. And I would hate to see, especially in fields like financial services or technology, where I've seen over the last 40 years since I've been working, that women are finally starting to make inroads in those industries. I would hate to see the Me Too movement backfire to the point where men would say, you know what, it's just easier if we don't have women around because it's not putting us in this precarious position.
Well, and I think any man who comes to that conclusion is probably not going to have a very successful business model, because they're not going to have access to the best people working for them.
Yeah, and we just need to stop like reading so much into things too. And again, this goes back to the media being, really just going overboard. That when the head of marketing at Uber resigned after less than a year, the media was all buzzing. Well, it means that Uber is still really a misogynistic organization. I mean, I don't know, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but it may just be that she was hired by the misogynist, and the new leadership said, you know what, we're better off not having her around and really starting with a fresh slate. It could have been purely a business reason as opposed to it being a woman reason.
It could have been. I honestly don't know anything about that situation, so I can't comment on that. Let's get back to tips that you have for women, especially younger women, but even older women, for how to handle situations that may be uncomfortable in the workplace.
Never, ever be afraid to speak up, would be my number one tip. I certainly have had my own incidents from the time I started working. And as I said, I spent most of my life in male-dominated industries. So I'm certainly not without my stories, but I always had the ability to just shut things down. And yeah, maybe my career would have gone in a different direction or would have gone farther if I hadn't been as vocal. But, I can't even think about that. I just know that, I did the right thing.
So let's talk about tips for people who want to be in a relationship with somebody.
That was actually what I was going to say. If you find yourself attracted to somebody in the workplace and you are going to go there, at some point, it's like no different from birth control or disease. At some point, you have to have the conversation. You first have to look at the employee handbook and say, is what we're doing breaking any rules? Because that's dangerous for everybody. You don't want to get fired because you just had like one night of whoopee.
And I do want to say, most people don't ever read their employee handbook.
No.
You do sign a form with HR that says you read it or says you read it, but most people don't actually read it. So I do think you do have to read the employee handbook, and people need to understand that from a legal perspective, the employee handbook can say you are not allowed to wear blue on Tuesdays. And if you wear blue on Tuesdays, they can fire you for that because you violated a term in the employee handbook. So people need to understand that, there's nothing wrong with wearing blue on Tuesdays in the real world. But if your company says that's a company policy, you have to abide by it or you can face the consequences.
It's also important that you not make anybody else around you uncomfortable. I was once in a work situation where the head of our department was in a relationship with one of my peers, and everybody knew it, but they were pretending that it wasn't going on. And they actually are now married. So there was a very happy ending to the story. But we felt like she was getting preferential treatment, and it was something we really couldn't bring up with our supervisor. I think if it happened today rather than 20 years ago, I probably would have been more comfortable saying to the department head, everybody knows that you're going out with blank, and it's making us all a little bit uncomfortable. And probably one of them would have looked for a job in another department once they were outed, because it was an awkward situation for everybody. So you do have to avoid anything that smacks of favoritism. And then you do have to think about if the relationship ends, or it's not just if the relationship ends, if professionally one person gets a promotion that the other person wanted. How does working together impact the personal relationship? And people I know, and I always ask the question, when I meet people who are working together with lovers or husbands and wives, it's like, how do you make it work? And they usually will say they have ground rules, that there's certain things that they're not allowed to talk about in bed or at the dinner table. You know, as I said, there are lots and lots of examples. I do think relationships can be held together because people have work in common. We spend so much time in the office that to say you should never hook up with the dude in the next cube. I gave the book that title just because it's
a great title. It's a terrific
great title. But and what I really believe is it's not an absolute don't. It's just know what you're getting into.
Right. And I think the tip about reading the employee handbook is a really great one. Certainly people in the military have to be very cognizant of all of those kinds of rules. I think it also, you still need to think about how does this affect your reputation? And of course, we're not in a time when, you know, a woman is given a huge scarlet letter if she's having an affair with somebody. But certainly if that person is married, that is something to be really concerned about. But also you still have to worry about those mean girls and guys who are going to talk about you and who are going to gossip about you. I had this situation once where I was
they'll sometimes gossip even if there's nothing going on. I mean, that used to happen all the time when I worked in corporate, that a woman would get a promotion and people would assume that it was because she slept her way to the top. And sometimes that may have been true, but sometimes it wasn't. And, you know, the fact that that's still out there, I think we need to really get over that, or to your point of men being afraid to hire somebody who's good looking because of the optics.
Yeah, I actually had a situation at a convention, and this, you know, business travel is a huge area where people can get into trouble. And I was at a convention and it was in a hotel, and I saw a guy who I was working with way down the hall at the moment that I walked into a hotel room with a gentleman who, unbeknownst to him, was actually my husband at the time. And I got down to the convention floor the next day and everybody was buzzing about, you know, how I had gone into a hotel room with a guy while I was at this convention. And I heard somebody talking and I called out across the convention floor, you know, Hugh, be sure you tell him that was my husband. Who worked for another company, but in the same industry. And so my husband was at the convention at the same time that I was. So he was very embarrassed when I outed his gossip as being, you know, totally unremarkable.
Yeah, no, gossip can be really dangerous thing because stories, and as I said, the media now is really fueling that fire and things become truth that may not in fact be true, maybe based on one person's reporting.
Well, I am certain, no, I got to stop you there. We cannot go into this fake news thing or give that any legs or any validation. I have to give a lot of credit to reporters, especially, you know, mainstream media reporters like Ronan Farrow, who not only get multiple confirmations of their stories, they spend weeks and months fact checking. So
absolutely.
I don't know of any situation. I can't think of one situation in the media that I have heard about that is not well substantiated. So I think we have to separate out what are the situations that most of us are in our daily lives where people are gossiping about us versus people who are important enough or significant enough or powerful enough or famous enough that their stories get in the media. You know, certainly our stories are not in the media. But I think if it's a reputable media outlet, people can be very sure that if they're putting something salacious in there, it has been documented.
I mean, that's a whole other topic. As a journalist, I can tell you that many of the outlets that I write for that would be considered reputable media outlets, I do my own fact checking. Some of the big media outlets have let their fact checkers go. And fact checking is not what it used to be. That said, I do think that the larger news outlets that are, as you said, the reputable outlets, they will thoroughly research a claim. especially if there have been multiple claims and if it's a public figure. But there are a few examples during the throes of the Me Too movement where it would be one person complaining about one media figure, and the media would jump all over it because it made for great news.
You have to give me an example.
All right, we all heard about Dustin Hoffman for a nanosecond, and then
I didn't.
all right, well, we read different media and we
really.
different actors. And I remember when I read that, it was like, oh my God, did he really do that? And then you never really heard about it again. Mm-hmm. So, you know, either there was a settlement deal made, and he even came forward. I mean, I suggest you Google it. He came forward and said, you know, it was the 1970s. People talked differently back then. He made some comments that in retrospect he wouldn't make today. I mean, I'm sure if somebody had a transcript of everything that I said over the last 40 years to male employees, there would probably be one or two things in there. I mean, thankfully, I'm not a major public figure.
Right. So if this is something he said and he acknowledged that it's possible that he said it, then it's not an issue.
No, it's not an issue. But once it's out there, you know, it sticks in people's heads. And
well, this even happened to Joy Reid. Joy Reid from MSNBC, who I love, by the way. She had a controversy where somebody dug up some old blog posts that she had written, where she said some inflammatory things. I don't remember what they were. And it was very embarrassing. And it was a news story for a couple of cycles. And then it went away. But yeah, absolutely. Things we said, again, things we say are different than things we do.
Yes. And the sad thing is that, you know, you say, and then it goes away. It doesn't really go away because now we have the web and we've got Google indexing. And
right, but it happened, and she acknowledged that it happened. Mm-hmm. And it was, you know, again, one of those things that she said, I wish, you know, I regret that I said these things. And that's the other thing here, is this whole issue of apologizing. I think in many cases, if you do something unintentionally, that's truly unintentional, and say I said something to you 20 years ago that really irritated you. And actually, I did have a situation where I brought this up, where I had a conversation in college with a bunch of women. It was a great conversation. And yes, we were talking about sex. And one of the women was a reporter for the school newspaper. And without our permission, she wrote an article directly quoting things that we did not mean to be in the school newspaper. And 30 years later, I confronted her about that, and she apologized. And it makes it, and we're good friends, and it makes it better. I think that if you do something that's inappropriate or wrong or even unintentional, or it didn't occur to you that was wrong at the time, even if it's 30 years later. I had a guy once who stole my golf cart in college. I had a golf cart because I had spinal surgery and I needed this to get around. And he and his friend were drunk and they stole the golf cart and they drove it into a fountain, which was really a hassle for me. And of course, a hassle for the school. And at our 25th reunion, when he was also drunk, he came up to me and acknowledged he was the one who did that. And he felt guilty about this all these years and he apologized. You know, apologies are a good thing.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Apologies in real life are essential. Mm-hmm. When you're talking about what's on the web, that lives on forever. Mm-hmm. And so I think we all just have to be a little more mindful of when stuff does get into the media or does get reported. Mm-hmm. It's going to live on forever and ever and ever. And the apology may not make it into the media, just that initial report. And as you said, most of us are not major media figures. But, you know, even the CEO of Intel, you know, that is going to live on forever in his permanent record. And it's not that he's a pervert. And it's not that he assaulted a woman in the ladies' room or men's room. He happened to have an extramarital affair with somebody he worked with. And, it's not up to me to judge. I'm not his wife. I feel bad for his family. But, that doesn't make him an incompetent CEO. It may mean
no, but I won't judge anybody for having an affair. But I will judge a CEO for not having read his own employee handbook and not taking the steps to make the appropriate changes. So I think that's the issue. Anyway, I could go on and on and on, obviously, all day long talking with you, but we are out of time. However, this episode will live in our permanent record because, of course, our podcasts are archived forever and ever on iTunes.
Which is great.
So I thank you so much for coming. I know people will really enjoy this conversation. I think the bottom line is there's no right answers.
And it's a topic that always stirs up controversy. I talked about this topic on a Canadian radio station on Valentine's Day. And the tweets that were coming in were just fast and furious because everybody does have an opinion. People have all been involved at some point or another with somebody from the workplace. Many women have been treated inappropriately and have handled it different ways. So it'll be interesting to see what this stirs up.
I can't wait for the feedback. But what I was going to say is there's no right answers, but there are lots and lots of wrong answers. So, and I think that if we want a starting place for commonality on this topic, is the starting place is to talk about, okay, here's what we agree on is definitely wrong and definitely a no. And then, of course, like most things we talk about in the ladies' room, there's lots of gray area and there's lots of circumstance. And my favorite quote that I'll end in is, it all depends on everything.
Love it.
I thank you so much for joining us. I look forward to everybody's feedback and comments on this and on individual stories. If I get questions, I will certainly take them in our weekly Facebook Live show, Ask Dr. Donica, Your Most Embarrassing Questions. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in and stay tuned till next time. Take care. Bye-bye. That's all we have time for today. But let's keep the conversation going on Twitter or Facebook at Dr. Donica. And please join us next week for another episode of In the Ladies' Room with Dr. Donica. Real conversations with real women about really intimate topics.